A waitress dropped a tray of champagne at a luxury gala. Seconds later, the most powerful man in the room pointed at her and said four chilling words, "You are mine now." What she overheard that night would change her life forever. Rain hammered against the towering glass walls of the Granville Hotel, turning the Manhattan skyline into a blur of silver light and shadow. Inside, the ballroom glowed like another universe entirely. Crystal chandeliers hung from ceilings painted with gold leaf, string music floated gently above quiet laughter, and the city's most powerful people gathered beneath it, all dressed in silk, diamonds, and tailored black suits. At first glance, it looked like generosity, a charity gala. But the longer I spend exploring stories like this, the more I realize something unsettling. Rooms filled with power rarely hold only kindness. Sometimes they hold secrets, and sometimes those secrets are dangerous enough to destroy lives. Tonight, one of those secrets was about to fall straight into the hands of someone who was never meant to hear it. Her name was Isabella Santos, 24 years old, nursing student, 3 part-time jobs just to keep rent paid on a small apartment in Queens. The kind of woman most of the people in that ballroom would never notice even if she stood right beside them. Which, ironically, is exactly why she was there. Invisible. Carrying a silver tray filled with crystal champagne flutes, Isabella moved carefully between clusters of wealthy guests discussing stock markets, political donations, and real estate deals worth more money than she would earn in a lifetime. Her hands trembled slightly as she balanced the tray. Not from weakness, from exhaustion. Anyone who works 3 jobs while studying medicine knows that kind of tired. But exhaustion was not the problem that night. Curiosity was. Near the terrace doors overlooking the rain-soaked city, 2 men stepped away from the crowd. They spoke quietly, their voices low enough that most people would have ignored them. Most people. But Isabella had drifted close enough to hear a single sentence that changed everything. "The shipment arrives Thursday," one man whispered. "Warehouse 17. Petrov wants confirmation before payment." "Weapons." The words slid through the conversation like a blade. "Illegal. Dangerous. Real." Isabella's pulse spiked. Instinct told her to walk away immediately. Pretend she heard nothing. Instead, she hesitated. And hesitation can be a powerful thing in the wrong moment. Her elbow struck a decorative plant stand. The tray slipped. Crystal glasses exploded across the marble floor with a violent sound that echoed through the entire ballroom. Music stopped. Conversation stopped. Every head turned. Isabella dropped to her knees in horror, scrambling to gather the broken shards as humiliation burned through her chest. But embarrassment was not what made her heart begin to race. It was the silence that followed. Because somewhere across that room, someone had already been watching. When Isabella finally looked up, she saw him. Tall, perfectly composed in a black suit. Dark hair swept back from a face that belonged on magazine covers. But it wasn't his appearance that made the air feel suddenly heavier. It was the way the crowd moved aside for him without being asked. The way security appeared behind him. The way his eyes locked onto hers like he had already decided something about her future. Aleandro Romano. He walked toward her slowly, expensive shoes clicking against marble while the room held its breath. Then he stopped 3 feet away from the frightened waitress kneeling among broken glass. He raised one hand, pointed directly at her, and said 4 words that would tear her life apart. "You are mine now." And if you've ever followed stories about dangerous love and powerful men the way I have, you already know something important. Sentences like that never mean something simple. They mean the beginning of a storm. Before we go deeper into what happened to Isabella Santos after that moment, let me take a second to say welcome to everyone listening. You're watching Rose's Stories, a place where we explore intense, emotional dark romance stories that make you question how far love, power, and fate can really go. If stories like this fascinate you the way they fascinate me, take a moment to subscribe to the channel. Your support helps keep these stories coming. And trust me, this one is only just beginning. What makes a moment like that so unsettling is that it rarely begins with someone extraordinary. It begins with someone completely ordinary. Long before Aleandro Romano ever spoke those 4 words, Isabella Santos lived a life that most people would never consider remarkable. And maybe that is exactly why her story matters. She woke most mornings before sunrise in a small apartment in Queens where the radiator rattled loudly enough to wake the neighbors. The building was old, The hallways smelled faintly of cleaning chemicals and last night's takeout, and the rent was always due sooner than she wished it was. But Isabella never complained about it. People who grow up learning how fragile life can be rarely waste time wishing for luxuries. At 24 years old, Isabella had already lived through the kind of loss that quietly reshapes a person's future. Her parents died in a car accident when she was 16. After that, the world became something she had to navigate largely on her own. The only family she had left was her uncle Thomas Santos, a man who took her in without hesitation but carried an air of quiet secrecy that Isabella never quite understood. Thomas worked unpredictable hours and often disappeared for days at a time. Sometimes he came home late at night with the tired look of someone who had been arguing with life itself. He rarely talked about his work. When Isabella asked, he would simply smile and tell her not to worry about things that were not her responsibility. Looking back, it is easy to wonder if she should have asked more questions. But at 18 years old, when you are trying to rebuild a future after losing everything, survival becomes the only priority. Isabella focused on one goal with almost stubborn determination. Nursing school. Helping people had always felt like the most honest way to exist in a complicated world. It was practical, meaningful, and most importantly, it was something she could build with her own effort rather than waiting for luck to change her circumstances. Columbia Nursing School was not easy to afford. Tuition alone was enough to scare most students away before they even filled out the application. So Isabella worked. Morning shifts at a cafe where the smell of burnt espresso clung to her clothes. Afternoon lectures where she studied anatomy, trauma care, and emergency response procedures. Late evening shifts at restaurants and private events where she learned how to move quietly between tables filled with people whose lives seemed unimaginably distant from her own. 3 jobs, sometimes 4. Sleep became something she treated like a luxury instead of a necessity. And yet something about Isabella stood out in a way that most people never noticed. She listened. In my experience, people who work in service jobs develop a strange kind of intelligence. When you spend hours each day surrounded by conversations you were never meant to be part of, you start understanding how different worlds operate. You begin to recognize the small signals that reveal who holds power and who simply pretends to. Isabella never chased those worlds, but she observed them quietly. That night at the Granville Hotel was just another job on her schedule. One more shift that would help pay tuition and keep the lights on in her apartment. When she arrived at the hotel, the ballroom was already filling with Manhattan's elite. Men with perfectly tailored suits and women whose jewelry reflected the chandelier light like small constellations. They laughed easily, spoke confidently, and moved through the room with the casual certainty of people who had never worried about whether their bank account could survive the month. Isabella carried trays of champagne through the crowd, invisible in the way service workers often are. And perhaps that is the part of the story I find most fascinating. Powerful people grow used to being watched. They guard themselves carefully when they know attention is on them. But they rarely notice the people they assume do not matter. The servers, the drivers, the assistants, the quiet figures moving along the edges of their world. That kind of invisibility can be dangerous, because it allows someone to hear things they were never meant to hear. And on that particular night, Isabella Santos drifted just close enough to a conversation that should have remained hidden forever. 2 men stepped away from the main crowd near the terrace doors overlooking the rain-soaked skyline. Their voices were low, their tone tense. And in that moment, without realizing it, Isabella stepped across a line that separated her ordinary life from something far more dangerous. The tragedy of moments like this is how small they seem while they are happening. A step closer. A single overheard sentence. A moment of curiosity. Yet those tiny decisions can quietly pull someone into a completely different future. And somewhere across that ballroom, a man named Aleandro Romano had already begun to notice that the young waitress with the steady eyes might not be as invisible as everyone else believed. And sometimes the exact moment a life changes forever does not feel dramatic at first. It feels awkward, embarrassing, almost small. That is exactly how it began for Isabella. The broken glasses were still scattered across the marble floor when the music slowly returned and the wealthy guests resumed their conversations. For them, the interruption had already faded into the background. In rooms like that, Mistakes made by service staff are rarely remembered longer than a few seconds. But Isabella felt every second. Her knees pressed against the cold floor while she tried to gather the sharp pieces of crystal with trembling fingers. Small cuts opened across her palms where the glass had bitten into her skin. She barely noticed the pain. What she noticed instead were the quiet glances drifting toward her from across the ballroom. There is a very particular kind of humiliation that comes from feeling invisible your entire life, only to suddenly become the center of attention for the wrong reason. Someone nearby muttered something about incompetent help. Another guest laughed softly. It was the kind of casual cruelty that rarely intends harm, but leaves a mark anyway. Yet embarrassment was not the emotion tightening Isabella's chest. Fear was, because when she looked up from the shattered glass, she saw that the two men from the terrace had stepped back into the room. Their conversation had stopped. Their eyes moved quickly across the ballroom, searching, and for a brief moment, those eyes landed directly on her. A quiet panic spread through Isabella's body. Maybe they had not heard her. Maybe they had not noticed that she had been standing near the door. Maybe footsteps interrupted the thought. Slow, confident, measured. The kind of footsteps that carry authority without needing to raise a voice. Isabella turned slightly, and that was when she saw him approaching. Aleandro Romano did not rush. Men like him rarely do. He moved through the crowd with the calm certainty of someone who knew the room would adjust itself around him. And it did. Guests shifted slightly as he passed. Conversations lowered. Even the security staff seemed to appear out of nowhere, taking positions behind him without needing instructions. I have always found it fascinating how power reveals itself in quiet ways. It is not always loud or aggressive. Sometimes it simply changes the atmosphere around a person. Aleandro stopped a few feet away from Isabella. Up close, the details became sharper. His suit was perfectly tailored, dark fabric falling effortlessly across broad shoulders. His hair was swept back neatly, revealing strong features that could have belonged to a model if his eyes had not carried something much heavier. Storm gray, alert, calculating. The kind of eyes that seemed to measure a situation in seconds. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Isabella slowly stood, still holding a piece of broken glass in her hand before realizing it, and dropping it quickly back onto the tray. "I'm sorry," she said quietly. "It was an accident." Aleandro's gaze did not leave her. Was it? The question was calm, almost gentle, but it carried a meaning that made Isabella's stomach tighten. "I didn't mean to interrupt anything," she added quickly. Aleandro tilted his head slightly, studying her expression with quiet interest. "I know." There was something unsettling about how certain he sounded. Two men in dark suits stepped forward beside Isabella, their presence firm but not aggressive. One of them lightly took the tray from her hands. The other rested a steady hand on her elbow. Not forceful, just enough to prevent her from walking away. "Wait," Isabella said, confusion rising into fear. "I have to finish my shift." Aleandro's attention remained fixed on her. "You're finished here." Across the room, the two men from the terrace had already disappeared back into the crowd. If they had noticed Isabella, they were pretending they had not. And that realization made her pulse quicken even more. "You heard something tonight," Aleandro continued. It was not phrased like an accusation. It sounded more like a fact. "I didn't," Isabella said quickly. Aleandro did not argue. Instead, he lifted his hand slightly, signaling the security men to remain calm. Then he stepped closer, lowering his voice just enough that the surrounding guests would not hear. "In my experience," he said quietly, "people who claim they heard nothing are usually the ones who heard the most." Isabella felt the weight of his words settle heavily in the air between them. She looked around the ballroom again. No one was watching anymore. Or perhaps they were simply pretending not to. Aleandro's gaze softened slightly as he observed the panic in her eyes. For the first time, something like concern flickered across his expression. "You're afraid," he said. "Of course I'm afraid," Isabella whispered. Aleandro nodded once, as if confirming a calculation. Then he did something that seemed to freeze the room again. He raised his hand, pointed directly at her, and spoke clearly enough that anyone nearby could hear. "You are mine now." The sentence was quiet, but the meaning behind it was enormous. Because in that moment, Isabella Santos realized she had stepped into a world where decisions were made faster than explanations could follow. And the most powerful man in the room had just decided that her life belonged under his protection. The moment those words left Aleandro Romano's mouth, the world Isabella had known quietly began to slip out of reach. What happened next moved quickly, almost too quickly for her to understand while it was unfolding. One moment she was standing beneath the bright chandeliers of the Granville Hotel, surrounded by music and laughter that no longer felt real. The next moment she was being guided through a private exit, away from the ballroom, away from the guests, and away from the life she had been living only minutes earlier. Outside, the rain had grown heavier. Black cars waited along the curb like silent sentinels, engines humming softly beneath the storm. The air smelled of wet pavement and city lights reflecting across the slick asphalt. Isabella hesitated when the car door opened. "This is insane," she said quietly, more to herself than anyone else. Aleandro stood beside her, his expression calm in a way that felt almost unsettling given the circumstances. The rain dotted the shoulders of his suit, but he didn't seem to notice. "You heard something tonight," he said again, his tone measured. "Something that places you in danger." "I told you, I didn't mean to," Isabella replied, her voice tight with confusion. "I was just working." Aleandro watched her carefully for a moment, as if trying to decide how much truth she could handle all at once. Then he gestured toward the car. "Get in." It wasn't spoken harshly. In fact, it was almost polite. But there was something final about the way he said it. Isabella glanced back toward the glowing entrance of the hotel. Through the glass doors, she could still see fragments of the gala continuing as if nothing unusual had happened. The orchestra had resumed its melody. Guests were laughing again. The world inside that ballroom had already moved on. Her world had not. Reluctantly, she stepped inside the car. Aleandro followed. For several minutes, the vehicle moved silently through Manhattan's rain-soaked streets. The city outside the window blurred into streaks of yellow lights and dark reflections. Isabella's mind raced. "Where are we going?" she finally asked. Aleandro did not look away from the window. "Somewhere safe." "Safe from what?" "From the men you overheard." He paused, then added something that made her stomach tighten. "And from the man they work for." Isabella turned toward him slowly. "You mean Petrov?" Aleandro's eyes flicked toward her. "Yes." There was something about the way he said the name that made it feel heavier than it should have. "Who is he?" she asked. Aleandro leaned back slightly in his seat. "Viktor Petrov runs one of the largest illegal weapons networks on the East Coast." Slightly, but the answer he gave carried the weight of reality rather than comfort. "That life changed the moment you overheard that conversation." Inside, the mansion's foyer felt almost unreal. Black marble floors reflected the glow of a massive chandelier. Oil paintings covered the walls. The ceilings stretched high above them like the interior of a cathedral. Isabella felt small standing there. Aleandro removed his coat and handed it to a waiting staff member. "Marco," he called. A tall man with graying hair stepped forward from the hallway. His posture was straight, his expression controlled in a way that suggested long experience in dangerous situations. "Yes, sir. This is Isabella Santos," Aleandro said. "She will be staying here for the time being." Marco studied her briefly. Then he nodded. "Understood." Isabella finally found her voice again. "I'm not staying here." Both men looked at her. Aleandro stepped closer, lowering his voice just enough to keep the conversation private. "Tell me something, Isabella," he said. "What? How many people know you overheard that conversation tonight?" "No one." Aleandro nodded once. "Good." He leaned closer. "Because if Petrov's men discover that you heard it," his eyes darkened slightly, "they will not ask questions." A chill ran down Isabella's spine. "And the only reason they have not found you yet," Aleandro continued quietly, "is because they don't know you exist." She swallowed. "And you do?" "Yes." "Why help me?" Aleandro studied her for a long moment. Then he said something that would follow her for the rest of her life. "Because in my world," he said calmly, "protection sometimes looks exactly like captivity." But the deeper Isabella stepped into Aleandro Romano's world, the more she began to understand that the real danger was not only outside the estate walls. Sometimes the truth itself can be just as unsettling. The first few days inside the Romano estate passed in a strange, suspended quiet. Isabella was given a room larger than her entire apartment in Queens. The bed alone looked like something from a luxury magazine, dressed in pale silk sheets that felt too smooth to belong to someone who had spent most of her life worrying about rent. Yet comfort did not bring peace. The windows overlooked acres of manicured gardens, but every path held the quiet presence of security. Cameras followed every angle of the property. Even the silence of the house felt controlled, like a place designed to anticipate problems before they could appear. It felt less like staying somewhere safe and more like living inside someone else's carefully designed system. Aleandro moved through that system with effortless authority. He was rarely loud, rarely rushed, but every person in the house seemed to respond instantly to his presence. Staff members adjusted schedules. Security teams rotated shifts. Conversations lowered when he entered a room. Watching him was like observing gravity in motion. And yet, the more Isabella saw of him, the more complicated her feelings became. He had taken her from the Gala without giving her a real choice. He spoke calmly about danger as if it were simply another business matter. And still, he had not threatened her, not once. He treated her like someone who mattered. That contradiction lingered in her mind. The answers finally began to surface one afternoon when Aleandro asked her to join him in his private office. The room itself looked more like a strategist's command center than a place for quiet work. Shelves lined with books, maps of shipping routes pinned across one wall, and several locked cabinets that hinted at information not meant for casual eyes. Aleandro stood near the desk when she entered. Marco remained nearby, holding a thick folder. Aleandro gestured toward the chair opposite him. Sit. Isabella remained standing. You said you would explain why I'm really here. Aleandro studied her carefully for a moment, then nodded once. Yes. He took the folder from Marco and opened it. Inside were photographs, documents, records printed on crisp white paper. Isabella stepped closer. The first photograph made her stomach tighten. It was her, leaving Columbia's nursing building. Another showed her walking into the cafe where she worked morning shifts. Another captured her unlocking the door to her apartment building. Dozens of images. Different days. Different locations. All of them unmistakably her. How long have you been watching me? She asked quietly. Aleandro did not avoid the question. 6 weeks. The number hit her harder than she expected. 6 weeks? She repeated. Yes. Her pulse quickened. Why? Aleandro closed the folder slowly. Because of your uncle. The words landed heavily in the air. Thomas Santos, Aleandro continued. Isabella crossed her arms instinctively. My uncle has nothing to do with any of this. Aleandro's expression did not change. That's where you're wrong. He reached into the folder again and placed several documents on the desk. Financial statements, shipping manifests, records of transactions between accounts that Isabella had never seen before. Your uncle has been involved in a medical supply smuggling operation for several years, Aleandro explained calmly. Stolen pharmaceuticals, surgical equipment, blood products taken from hospital inventories and sold through illegal networks. Isabella stared at the papers. That doesn't make sense. It does when you understand who his buyers were. Aleandro leaned forward slightly. Viktor Petrov's organization. The name again. Heavy. Dangerous. Isabella shook her head slowly. No. My uncle wouldn't. He already did. Aleandro's voice remained steady, but there was no cruelty in it. Only certainty. He needed someone with access to hospitals. Someone who could move supplies without raising suspicion. The realization crept into Isabella's mind slowly. Then all at once. You think that was supposed to be me? Aleandro met her gaze. Yes. The room felt suddenly smaller. He encouraged you to pursue nursing. Aleandro continued quietly. Asked questions about hospital inventory systems, emergency supply protocols, storage procedures. Memories shifted inside Isabella's mind. Conversations she had never questioned. Curiosity that once seemed harmless. He was preparing you, Aleandro said. Whether you realized it or not. Isabella sank into the chair behind her. I never agreed to anything. I know. The words were immediate. Aleandro placed the folder back on the desk. That's why I started watching you. To see if I was involved. Yes. And Aleandro paused. You weren't. Silence settled between them. For a moment Isabella simply stared at the photographs of herself spread across the desk. Every routine moment of her life captured and catalogued. You called me an asset, she said quietly. Aleandro did not deny it. That was my first assumption. The honesty surprised her. And now? Aleandro hesitated. Now I know you were never part of Petrov's operation. Isabella looked up slowly. So you decided to protect me. Yes. By watching me without telling me. Aleandro's jaw tightened slightly. If Petrov suspected you knew anything, you would already be dead. The words were harsh, but the truth inside them was difficult to ignore. Still, something inside Isabella resisted accepting it so easily. I don't know how to trust you, she admitted. Aleandro's expression softened in a way that felt unexpectedly human. You don't have to trust me yet. Then what do you expect? He held her gaze. Time. Isabella exhaled slowly. Time. It was a simple word, but in that moment it carried enormous weight. Because the truth Aleandro had just revealed changed something fundamental. The danger surrounding Isabella had not started the night of the gala. It had been quietly growing around her for years. And the man standing across from her was not just someone who had taken control of her life. He was someone who had been watching from the shadows long before she ever realized she needed protection. Once the truth was out in the open, the fragile calm inside the Romano estate began to feel like the quiet before something inevitable. When a person discovers that their past has been quietly manipulated, something shifts inside them. It is not always anger at first. Sometimes it is clarity, the kind that strips away illusions you did not even know you were holding. For Isabella, that clarity arrived in the days following Aleandro's confession. She began to see the estate differently. At first, it had looked like a fortress meant to keep danger out. But now she noticed something else. It was also a place designed to prepare for when danger inevitably arrived. Security rotations were precise. Communications systems ran constantly in the background. The people who worked for Aleandro moved with the calm focus of individuals accustomed to pressure. This was not a household that hoped for peace. It was one that understood conflict. Aleandro himself seemed to carry that same awareness. He was quieter during those days, spending long hours in meetings with Marco and the security team. Maps appeared across the office walls. Routes, ports, warehouses, and shipping lanes marked with careful notes. Viktor Petrov had not forgotten the failed shipment. Men like Petrov rarely accepted losses without retaliation. The attack came 3 nights later. It began shortly after midnight. At first it was only a distant sound that slipped into Isabella's dreams. A sharp crack that could almost be mistaken for thunder if someone wanted to believe the storm had returned. But storms do not echo in measured bursts. Gunfire does. Isabella sat upright in bed, her heart racing before her mind had fully processed the sound. Somewhere in the distance, alarms began to rise across the estate. Red emergency lights flickered along the hallway outside her room. Footsteps ran past the door. A knock came seconds later. Miss Santos, Marcos. Voice said from the other side. We need to move. When she opened the door, he was already wearing tactical gear, a radio clipped to his vest. What's happening? Petrov. The single word carried everything that needed to be understood. Marco guided her quickly through the corridor and down a staircase she had never noticed before. Hidden security doors slid open as they approached, revealing a reinforced room deep inside the structure of the house. The safe room. The walls were lined with monitors displaying live camera feeds from across the property. Floodlights illuminated the dark gardens outside. Figures moved through the trees in coordinated formations. Armed men, some wearing Romano security uniforms. Others dressed in darker tactical clothing moving with aggressive purpose. Isabella stepped closer to the screens. The estate had transformed into something completely different from the quiet refuge she had seen during the day. One of the monitors showed Aleandro. He moved through the outer courtyard with calm precision, directing his security team with subtle gestures. There was no panic in his movements, only control. Watching him in that moment revealed something that had been hidden beneath his composed exterior. Aleandro Romano was not simply a man who owned a powerful organization. He was someone who had spent years surviving conflicts like this. Marco spoke quietly beside her. They've been tracking us since the gala. How many? Enough to cause problems. Isabella studied the monitors instinctively. In nursing school, she had learned to read chaotic situations quickly. Emergency triage required a calm mind and the ability to prioritize survival over panic. Her eyes moved across the screens. One detail caught her attention immediately. They're targeting the generators, she said. Marco glanced at her. Yes. If the power goes out, the cameras go dark. That's the plan. On the screen, Aleandro's team moved toward the lower level where the backup generators were located. Seconds later, the camera feed erupted in flashes of light. Gunfire. Short bursts. Close range. The image flickered as smoke filled the hallway. When the screen cleared again, Aleandro was still standing. But something about his movement had changed. He shifted his weight slightly, one hand pressed against his shoulder. "He's hurt," Isabella said quietly. Marco watched the screen, his expression controlled. "It looks like a graze." Still, the sight of blood spreading across Aleandro's sleeve tightened something inside her chest. The battle continued for nearly an hour. Security teams pushed the attackers back toward the perimeter until the remaining vehicles retreated into the darkness beyond the gates. Gradually, the alarms quieted. The estate returned to silence. But it was not the same silence as before. This one carried the weight of what had almost happened. Aleandro returned inside not long after. His shirt was stained with blood where the bullet had grazed his shoulder. Marco and another guard helped him toward one of the medical rooms. Without thinking, Isabella stepped forward. "I can treat that." Aleandro looked at her, surprise flickering briefly across his expression. "You don't have to. I know." She gestured toward the wound. "But I'm the only trained medical professional in the house." He allowed her to guide him to a chair. As she cleaned the injury and stitched the torn skin, the room grew quiet again. Up close, she noticed something she had not seen before. Scars. Old ones. Faint white lines crossing his shoulder and ribs. The marks of someone who had survived more than one battle. "You've been doing this a long time," she murmured. Aleandro watched her carefully. "Long enough." When she finished the final stitch, Isabella stepped back. The room remained still for a moment. Then Aleandro spoke. "Petrov won't stop. I know. He will come for you again." Isabella considered the words carefully. Just days earlier, she had been a nursing student trying to pay tuition and survive another exhausting semester. Now she was standing inside the center of a war she had never asked to join. Yet something inside her had already changed. Fear had not disappeared, but it had been replaced by something steadier. Understanding. She met Aleandro's eyes. "Then we stop him first." For a moment, Aleandro simply studied her expression, and in that moment, he realized something important. The frightened waitress from the Gala no longer existed. Somewhere between the broken glass and the gunfire, Isabella Santos had crossed a line. She was no longer just someone being protected. She was someone who had decided to stand inside the fight. And once someone makes the decision to stand inside the fight, the story inevitably moves toward its final confrontation. The information gathered after the attack on the estate led Aleandro to one place, a shipping complex near the East River where Viktor Petrov had quietly rebuilt what remained of his operation. Warehouses stood in long rows beside the water, their metal walls reflecting pale industrial lights that never fully pushed back the darkness. It was the kind of place where cargo moved at night and questions were rarely asked. Aleandro's team moved carefully through the area just before dawn, when the city still slept and the harbor was wrapped in a thin gray fog. Plans had been prepared, routes mapped, contingencies discussed. For Aleandro, operations like this were almost routine. For Isabella, it was something entirely different. Just weeks earlier, her life had been measured by hospital schedules and exam deadlines. Now she stood beside men preparing for a confrontation that would determine whether the dangers surrounding her life would finally end. Yet the fear she expected to feel was not as overwhelming as she once imagined. Perhaps that is something people rarely admit about courage. It is not the absence of fear. It is the quiet decision to keep moving even when fear is present. Aleandro had told her to stay behind that morning. She did not. Not out of defiance, but out of clarity. If Petrov's war had begun because of what she overheard, then running from the ending would never truly give her peace. Inside the warehouse, the final meeting unfolded with tense stillness. Viktor Petrov stood near a line of shipping containers, his pale eyes watching Aleandro with the cold patience of a man who had built his reputation on intimidation. Several of his remaining associates lingered nearby, their confidence thinner now that their network had begun to collapse. For a moment, the two men simply faced one another across the open space. In stories about power, this is the moment when everything that has been building quietly beneath the surface finally rises into the open. Petrov spoke first, his voice calm but edged with bitterness. All of this because of one small mistake. Aleandro's response carried none of the anger Petrov seemed to expect. Your mistake was underestimating the consequences. The tension broke quickly after that. Petrov's men moved first, hoping to reclaim control of the situation before Aleandro's team could close the distance. But the conflict ended almost as quickly as it began. Aleandro's people had prepared too carefully, and the advantage shifted in seconds. When it was over, the warehouse fell silent except for the distant sound of water against the docks. Viktor Petrov's network would not threaten anyone again. Aleandro turned toward Isabella, who had remained near the entrance with Marco during the confrontation. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The tension that had surrounded them since the night of the gala had finally dissolved into something quieter. "You shouldn't have come," Aleandro said softly. Isabella met his gaze. "Maybe not," she replied. "But I needed to see where this ended." He studied her expression, as if realizing that the woman standing before him was no longer the frightened waitress he had taken from the ballroom weeks earlier. "Are you afraid of my world now?" he asked. Isabella considered the question carefully. "I'm afraid of what people become when they think power gives them permission to harm others," she said. "But that's not what I see when I look at you." The silence between them shifted again, this time carrying something warmer. Not ownership, not obligation, choice. And sometimes the most surprising thing about dark romance stories is not the danger that surrounds them. It is the moment when two people realize that despite everything they have been through, they are no longer standing on opposite sides of the same life. They are standing together inside it. And when the noise of conflict finally fades, what remains is not the battle itself, but the life people choose to build afterward. 6 months later, Manhattan looked different from the quiet height of Romano Tower. From the balcony, the city stretched endlessly beneath the evening sky, its streets glowing with the restless rhythm of millions of lives moving at once. Somewhere down there were hospitals where Isabella once studied late into the night, cafes where she rushed between shifts, and apartment buildings where ordinary people still lived the kind of life she once believed would be her entire future. Yet the path that brought her here had changed everything. Now Isabella stood beside Aleandro Romano, not as someone rescued from danger, but as someone who had stepped willingly into a more complicated world. The Romano Medical Foundation had become her focus, building clinics and support programs for communities that too often went unnoticed. In many ways, it was the life she once imagined, helping people, healing where she could. Only now the scale was far greater. Aleandro joined her at the railing, his presence steady beside her. "Do you ever wish that night at the gala had never happened?" he asked quietly. Isabella watched the city lights for a moment before answering. "No," she said, "because sometimes the moments that begin with fear are the ones that reveal who we truly become. And if there is one thing I have learned from following stories like this, it is that dark romance is not really about danger. It is about the choices people make when fate unexpectedly changes the direction of their lives." When you step back and look at the entire journey of Isabella Santos, what stands out is not the danger, the power, or even the unexpected romance. What stands out is the quiet moment when an ordinary person is forced to make an extraordinary choice. Isabella never asked to be part of a world filled with hidden conflicts and powerful enemies. She began as someone simply trying to survive, studying late, working long hours, and building a future one careful step at a time. Yet when circumstances changed her path, she discovered something inside herself that many people never realize they possess: the ability to adapt, to grow stronger, and to choose courage over fear. Stories like this remind us that life rarely unfolds the way we imagine. Most people plan their future with clear expectations about where they will go and who they will become. But sometimes a single moment, a conversation overheard, a decision made under pressure, a person unexpectedly entering our life, can change everything. What matters in those moments is not the disruption itself, but how we respond to it. The deeper lesson here is that strength does not always appear in loud or dramatic ways. Often it appears quietly, when someone decides to stop seeing themselves as powerless and begins taking responsibility for the direction of their life. Isabella could have remained afraid of the chaos surrounding her, but instead she chose to stand up, face reality, and turn a frightening situation into a meaningful purpose by helping others through the work she built afterward. In our own lives, we may never face the kind of dramatic circumstances seen in this story, but we all encounter moments where we must choose between fear and growth. Whether it is a new opportunity, a difficult challenge, or an unexpected change, the question is always the same. Will we allow uncertainty to stop us, or will we use it as a chance to become stronger than we were before? Now I would love to hear your perspective. If you were in Isabella's position, would you have walked away from that dangerous world, or would you have stayed and faced it the way she did? Please share your thoughts in the comment section so everyone can read and learn from different viewpoints. And if you enjoy stories that explore powerful emotions, difficult choices, and unforgettable characters, consider subscribing to Rose's Stories. Your support helps this channel continue bringing you deeper and more meaningful stories in future videos.